Welcome you all to this brief presentation on Aristotle's Poetics. I am Shanavas Pattupara, Assistant Professor in the PG Department of English, Amal College of Advanced Studies, Nilambur. Before we start discussing his seminal work that is Poetics, let's have a brief introduction to his life and philosophy. Aristotle's father was a physician at the Palace of Macedonius, and he was the most brilliant student at Plato's academy, who had come from Athens in 367 from his native Strategia in Macedonia to study with Plato. Aristotle's enormous contribution to the study of history actually thought spans several areas: uh, metaphysics, logic, ethics, politics, literary criticism, and various branches of natural science. In 343, King Philip of Macedon invited Aristotle to serve as a tutor to his son Alexander at his court in Pella. And having completed this project successfully, Aristotle returned to Athens to open his own school of rhetoric and philosophy. The school was called Lyceum, which was dedicated to Apollo, and it had a huge library, a history museum, and a zoological garden. And as we all know, he was known in the ancient world for basically his work, dialogues, uh, 27 dialogues to be very precise, but they did not survive the onslaught of time. And what remains at present is the dialogues composed by Aristotle and rather compiled by his own disciples, and which are the collection of his last 12 years of his life. And this Poetics is actually a 26 chapter treatise on the art of writing poetry. For Aristotle, poetry and rhetoric had the status of productive sciences. These disciplines had their place in a hierarchy of knowledge. Aristotle viewed them as rational pursuits, as seeking a knowledge of universals rather than that of random particulars, and therefore studying poetry has a social moral function according to Aristotle. So Aristotle's Poetics has often been analyzed in terms of his prescriptions for tragedy, his distinctions of tragedy, epic and other genres, as well as his comment on plot and character. We will discuss all these things separately in the succeeding part of this presentation, so I am not attempting to have a detailed discussion now. We all know that Aristotle's Poetics is often viewed as a response to Plato's scathing remark against literature, how Plato leveled serious charges against literature as being a corruptive force, how it only appeals to the emotions, therefore it does not appeal to the brain, it does not appeal to the intellect of the individuals, therefore they are harmful to the society. How the poets are often seen as the crankers and caterpillars of society who would corrupt the individuals, and therefore they could not have a place in the ideal republic that Plato had actually envisaged. So many of the charges that Plato has leveled against literature has been answered befittingly by Aristotle. Aristotle has defended the charges against literature, and so that we can actually understand when we discuss these parts. While the arts and poetry may have their own laws and offer pleasure, this pleasure is integral to further moral aim which is institutionalized in education. So Plato had said that poetry simply appeals to the emotions. Poetry simply appeals to the pleasure of human beings. But what Aristotle wanted to say is that the kind of pleasure that literature generates is something which has a moral aim in an ideal society. And in contrast with Plato's ideal state, where it is viewed as an obstacle to morality, pleasure was viewed by Plato as an obstacle, as an impediment to morality. rationality and genuine knowledge. According to Plato, poetry actually would serve a positive function in a society. So the poetry can make a human being moral, poetry can make a human being rational, poetry can make a human being pursue genuine knowledge, unlike how Plato actually argued against poetry. So Aristotle actually begins this treatise on poetics and tragedy by discussing imitation and action. At the core of Aristotle's Poetics are two complex notions, imitation and action. We call it mimesis, which are imbued with Aristotle's metaphysical principles and his ethical and political dispositions. So in Poetics, he states that from childhood men have instinct for imitation, and that is what distinguishes man from other animals. That that is far more imitative. Human beings are far more imitative. All men in varying degree find pleasure in learning, and human beings rely on imitation for learning. So learning is something very instinctual for human beings, and for the process of learning, of course, men do rely on imitation. So imitation is very basic to every person. That is what Aristotle tries to argue in the beginning of his work, Poetics. For Aristotle, imitation is both a mode of learning and, of course, it is associated with pleasure as well. It's a mode of learning, but this mode of learning gives us pleasure. He holds that the pleasure lies not in the object which is imitated, but in the very process of imitation itself. The very process of imitation gives a human being the pleasure, which may not be the object of what we imitate, doesn't matter. That very process actually gives every individual the kind of pleasure that actually the imitation gives, which yields learning through a process of inference. So Aristotle has tried to establish a connection between poetic imitation and action. Poetry is a productive art, unlike what Plato has said, which is rather a useless kind of thing, which does not serve any utilitarian ends. Poetry had no place in his ideal republic. But Plato said that poetry could be a productive art. It's not an end in itself. Its purpose is to represent action. So, according to Aristotle, poetry emerges from the human instinct to imitate things, as we've already said, and the instinct for rhythm and harmony. So, all the imitations that we try to have a rhythm in it, have a harmony in it, and that finally results in poetry. For example, music is the example for the imitation of life through rhythm and harmony. So through music, what we do, we are imitating life rhythmically and with a harmonious blend of sounds. So that's an example for an exemplary imitation of human beings. Dancing imitates character, or dancing imitates emotions, dancing imitates actions through rhythmical movements of our limbs, our organs, our body, the movement of our body. So dancing is a process of imitation through which we try to imitate a character, perhaps an emotion, seen Kathakali and all, or maybe an action through the rhythmical movement of that one. Again, when we talk about poetry, that's an example for the imitation of life through language by the careful deployment of words in different order and bringing about harmony and rhythm and rhyme in the ordering of the words and sentences and lines in the poem. We also have the beautiful imitation in poetry as well. So in Poetics, the first chapter to three chapters, I'm not discussing each chapter in detail, but some of the chapters will be clubbed together because the ideas that he discusses throughout Poetics are spread in different chapters. So there may be a repetition of the points that we discuss in one point because it may be reappearing in other chapter as well. So Poetics, let's talk about it. So as we have already said, he begins the treatise by talking about imitation, which is a basic virtue of all fine arts, be it music or dance, or painting or whatever. So imitation is both a mode of learning and it is associated with pleasure. That's we've already said about it. And discusses when he discusses this, what you can say, the genesis of poetry, he actually has this following points. One is man likes imitation. These are repetitions, but we are just repeating in order to reinforce some of the major points and arguments that he has already put forward. See, man likes imitation, so imitation is quite instinctual. Second, it gives pleasure, and imitation is a process of learning. So men derive pleasure from harmony and rhythm. So poetry has both in it. So poetry, when we imitate a noble action, you know, which results in the production of hymns, which were further developed into, epics. For example, the Iliad and Odyssey by Homer is an example. So when there is an imitation of the noble actions of the noble personages, it results in hymns, it results in epics, it results in tragedy. When the imitation is of the trivial people, maybe actions of lower importance, those things actually result in comedy. And Margets by Homer is an example for that. And Plato also discusses different branches of fine arts and different types of imitation. And he speaks about three things. One is medium, objects, and manner. So the medium of imitation means colors. For example, a painter, an artist, uses different colors and he brings in harmony on the canvas by applying the colors in an imaginative way. But it can be in the form of a form in the case of, for example, sculpture, or maybe sound in the case of a musician. And when it comes to drama and poetry, it is the objects that are imitated. Maybe objects of imitation are more important. Means men are imitated. Their actions are important. Their actions are imitated. So objects are imitated. What is imitated is more important. In certain fine arts, imitation, the mode of imitation is important. The medium through which imitation is taking place is more important, as I've just said, be it color or form of sound. Whereas in some cases, the objects of imitation is more important. Means whom are we imitating? Are we imitating the greater people, the aristocrats, the kings and lords, or are we imitating the slaves, the ordinary people, the marginalized? So according to Aristotle, that would tell upon the nature of the genre. That means whether it's a tragedy or a comedy, whatever. So that's important. And also the manner also would distinguish the genres of literature. For example, when it is in a narrative mode of imitation, which will be an epic, when it is a dramatic mode of imitation, it can be dramatic. It can be a drama, it can be a tragedy. Chapter 5, Comedy, Epic Poetry and Tragedy. These are some of the points he discusses in his fifth chapter of Poetics, where he actually discusses the difference between some of the differences between tragedy and an epic, or how epic is different from tragedy, we can say. One is an epic is always in a narrative form. That is one of the advantages we can see in the case of that one. One of the differences, it's a narrative form. Secondly, it does not observe the unity of time. See, when we talk about tragedy, we will say that tragedy will have three unities of time to be observed according to Aristotle. But epic poem does not have to follow the unity of time. An epic can tell us the story which spans more than 100 years, whereas a tragedy cannot tell us such a big story because it has to be presented. When it is presented on the stage, that should be, the reader should be able to remember all those things in their memory. So it should be short, it cannot have such a long one. So unity of time need not be observed in the case of an epic. An epic usually uses the heroic meter, whereas tragedies may use different type of meters depending upon the context. And another one was that the critics before Aristotle had argued that tragedy should be actually tragedies were inferior to epics, or epics were better than tragedies. But Aristotle was of the view that in tragedy was superior because a tragedy had all the elements of an epic, but an epic did not have all the elements of a tragedy. So therefore, tragedy is far superior to epics according to Aristotle. That was his major argument. And these are some of the differences he tries to bring in between epics and one. The medium of expression. In the case of epics, it is the language is the medium of expression, whereas in the case of tragedy, it is the action. It is to be narrated in the case of an epic, whereas it has to be performed on the stage in the case of a tragedy. And one more thing you should understand, there is something called a closet drama. A closet drama is something which is just meant for reading, not to be staged. And then an epic uses the device of imagination. In the case of tragedy, along with the device of imagination, it also makes use of music and spectacle that we will discuss in detail in the succeeding part of this presentation. An action in epic poem has no limit, as we already saw it in the previous slide, that an epic did not have to observe the unity of time, whereas a tragedy is bound by the unity of time. Therefore, the action in tragedy is confined to a single revolution of the sun. So, the story cannot go beyond a single day because the viewers, the spectators, the audience cannot actually remember the story if it spans many years. So, these are some of the differences we can find. Then the chapter 6th of Poetics has a discussion of tragedy. That is one of the main aspects of this Poetics. So he offers a definition which encompasses almost all features of what tragedy constituted according to him at that period of time. So his view on tragedy is encapsulated in this very precise definition of tragedy that he gave in his Poetics. So he said tragedy is the imitation of an action, serious, complete, and of certain magnitude, in a language embellished with each kind of artistic ornaments being found in different parts of the play, through action, not narration, arousing pity and fear, affecting the catharsis of the emotions. So, when we talk about this definition, some of the ideas that actually he had in his mind when we talked about tragedy becomes very clear when we read this definition. So it's an imitation of an action. So as we already said, poetry in general, including tragedy, is an imitation. And because imitation, we already saw that according to Aristotle, imitation was something very basic to human beings. So it's an imitation of an action. So tragedy imitates an action. And what kind of an action? A serious action. So only a serious action is fit to be imitated in a tragedy, and that should be complete. That should be complete means, it should have a beginning, it should have a middle, and it should have an end that we will discuss. And it should have a certain magnitude, the length of tragedy that should be of a given time limit. There should be some unity of time, unity of place, unity of action, and then the language used in tragedy that should be embellished with each kind of artistic ornaments. Different devices would be used. The different kinds of language devices would be used. It will be the tragedy will be decorated with, embellished with different kinds of artistic ornaments, and they are spread in different parts of the play. And a tragedy is presented not through narration, as was the case of epics, but it was presented through action and arousing pity and fear, affecting the catharsis of these emotions. And the ultimate result of a tragedy is that it arouses pity and fear in the mind of the audience, and thereby purgating, purifying the emotions of the 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 emotions of the audience. These emotions means, the pity and fear, creating, arousing the pity and fear in the mind of the audience. They try to purify the the audience. So that's the effect of tragedy.